So hello and welcome to this video on the Analogue Solutions generator. Let's check out what's to come before we get into it. The generator is a lovely orange-backed 3-row CV sequencer and gate generator from Analogue Solutions. It's available in Eurorack or standalone. Standalone just takes power and we get all the same connections as Eurorack. This just has a ribbon power cable on the back of the module. Now at its core, this is 3 rows of CV sequencing, gate generator, flipped gate, internal clock, performable touchpad transposing, additional sequencer, and there's lots of ways to use it. This is far better served looking at the unit, and we'll go through its features before we get into the patches, rather than looking at my fugly mug. So let's jump into it. So I'll hit play and let's look at the features of the generator. We have 3 rows of entirely analog unquantized voltages. They have their outputs at A, B and C over on the right hand side. We do have transpose inputs for A, B and C, and we can see on the dots above the jacks that they are inputs. Sequences are 16 steps across 3 rows, of course. We have a start and end position, and these are these dim LEDs. If I turn all these gates down, we can see these dimmer LEDs. If we wanted to loop this section, the LED on row C shows us the playback position, the step that we're on, dim LED, start and end position. Now we get one gate output and a flipped gate, and the gate is a rather unique feature in that we can take the first, the second, the third or the fourth note within a given beat and increase the amount of gates active in that pattern. So when we're counting musical groups of 4, you might have heard 1, 2, 3, 4, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, and I look great doing these hand waving motions and counting. If we're counting 16th notes, we would count 1 E and D, 2 E and D. So these are all the 1, 2, 3, 4s. These are the E's, these are the ands, and these are the Ds. As I turn them up, we can see the first quarter note is active, second, first and second, third, first and third, second and third, first, third and second, and so on. And every combination of that active gate or active step, we do the same on the second note. Let's have all the main beats on and we'll see that second note next to it start to fill out. The third or the and, the off beats, and the D, the last 16th note in the pattern. So by combining and varying amounts of these that are active, we can generate some interesting and unique gate rhythms. And we get 2 copies of this gate output, the line indicating these are the same. We also get the flipped gate, and this is every step that doesn't have a gate does have a gate on the flipped output. It's the exact opposite behavior of the gate. So it's useful to have this kind of 16th note pattern playing off itself in 2 opposing rhythms. The internal clock generator has a nice wide-ranging tempo. It has an output. We can CV that clock as well. Now we have a start input and we can turn this off of loop and play this like a one-shot. So if I just hit play, it plays through and stops. We can do that with an external voltage for a one-shot play through that pattern. We also get an output at the end of every pulse, and taking us down to the voltage generator, we can have that end pulse move across the first 4 steps of this voltage generator. So setting this to loop, hitting play. Notice every time it goes round, this will move our voltage generator. So the voltage generator serves 3 different outputs. We have a quantized VG output, and this is the only section of the generator that's quantized. It's quantized to semitones within a volt per octave setting, so we can use it for quantized musical outputs. It has its own CV output, which is the actual pressure that we apply to these pads, giving us a nice performance, human, interactive element to the playing, and a gate output that is when we touch any of those pads. We also get the raw voltage out of this as well. Now on this switch, we can choose to shift and transpose either row C's output or A, B, C, and D. We can set this to an external clock. We can reset it. We can move through the step manually, which is great when you're, say, using 3 different pitches and you want to really carefully tune up a chord, step through, tune the next one, and so on. Going back to the internal clock and these gate patterns, we can actually CV the intensity, and we'll do this in a patch later, bringing in more gates or taking out gates as well. The fill input is just the last 4 beats. We can input a voltage to create a fill just on the last 4 outputs relating to this gate, or CV the intensity of the whole thing. MIDI, which is for sync, this doesn't have a MIDI out, it's not a MIDI sequencer, it's a voltage sequencer for analog synth, Eurorack, semi-modular, and the like. So that's it for the features. Let's dive into some patches. So here I have the Roland System 500. It's been sequenced by the generator. I'm taking the clock out into my Eurorack system into a clock divider that's giving us this 4 to the floor kick, and there's some stereo reverb effects as well. I'm just going to go through some of the features, and what I'm doing in this patch is very performable, very enjoyable. It's really fun, dynamic, live, performable sequencer. The top row here is pitch, and then using these gate densities, I'm sending an envelope to my filter. So as I jam around on these, we'll hear that filter envelope cut in and out with different gate rhythms. And we can influence this with the intensity input and actually take an LFO, and you'll see and hear, well, you'll see the LEDs change, you'll hear the different envelope patterns. Now I'm also taking row B to the filter's cutoff. So if I open up every gate, have every gate playing, just going to change its effect on the filter and turn up the modulation from row B. So row A for pitch, row B for filter cutoff. And being able to mix row B's output and the gate it creates to use an envelope on the filter. Gives some really nice dynamic patterns from even just a really basic synth voice. Now being able to change those start and end points gives some very different sounding sequences. Some polymetric patterns. There's a 5-step pattern, for example. And having this transpose still based on these start and end points. We're using all 3 lanes on the generator for modulation. I'm changing the model on that mutable instruments, plats, the tone, the timbre, harmonics, being able to plug this in and out, change the whole thing, change the mode that we're in. And I'm also splitting one of the outputs from the sequencer to control the reverse on and off in stereo on my delay effect. You wouldn't look at the generator and think of it necessarily as a rhythm or gate trigger sequencer. 3 rows of CV, we're thinking CV, pitch, modulation, melodies, patterns. But here I'm using it as 4 different rhythm sources to trigger these drum sounds. So I'll remove these sources. Now first I'm using row C as a bass drum gate generator. Now this is just CV, but if we think of a gate as just something that comes on and off, a voltage goes up and then down again, we can use it to trigger notes. So turning down every step, I'll show you what I mean. We can see the LED running along row C. If I turn up the first step, at a certain point, the voltage is going to be high enough to trigger this sound. And this is my bass drum. But because this voltage will stay high for the duration of that step, I couldn't have what I'm classing as a 16th note sequence here. I couldn't have the first 2 steps playing these first 2 16th notes. It would just give me a longer gate. That's because for this to re-trigger, simply for this to re-gate, to remake a different note, hit the drum twice as it were, that voltage needs to go off and back on again. If these first 4 steps are all up, they're just on constantly like a held gate. So I could have these 2 steps trigger, but just not 2 that are next to each other. So that's somewhat of a restriction, but this is a CV sequencer, not gates. So I could do a simple 4 to the floor kind of thing. Let's stick with that for now. And on the top row, I'm doing exactly the same, and I've just turned up steps 5 and 13 as my kind of snare-like or clap-like sound. Let's make a different bass drum pattern. Add an extra little clap at the end. And I'm well aware that's not a clap or a snare sound. I'm just enjoying some simple, kind of primitive percussion. Now, of course, a big part of the generator is this nice, interesting rhythmic gate source. So taking the gate out, here's a little tom sound panned left, play around. And the flipped gate works really well when we have 2 sounds panned hard left and right. I'll just remove these, because these sounds now play off of each other. The gate to the left and the flipped gate, the steps that are off to the right. So if they're all off, that's the sound on the right. If they're all on, it's the sound in the left. And it means I can use 2 sounds to create an interesting stereo 16th note pattern. So that's the way to use these as primitive gate sequence, which it ultimately gives us potentially 3 gates out of A, B, C and D. The actual gate patterns, that's a 4th one, the flipped gate which is 5, and we've also got the clock which is 6. So it becomes a fun and interesting way to jam with rhythmic material as well. So this patch again is using the generator to control filters, distortions, low pass gates. It's been synced to another Eurorack sequencer, it's synced really well here. And I'm using both gates from Eurorack and from generator to trigger different low pass gate channels, just really excite this patch. Super noisy jam. Let's just get stuck in. 3 different CV rows here are feeding 3 channels on a quantizer and giving us 3 voice chords out of 3 different analog oscillators, kind of paraphonically through the same filter and VCA in my Eurorack patch behind this case. Now for better control and tuning before I even hit the quantizer, I've taken each of the 3 ABCD outputs from the generator into attenuators, and I'm attenuating down the potential range of each of these knobs. It shaves a few octaves off the potential range and just makes fine tuning on any kind of analog sequencer, and here on generator much easier before it hits the quantizer. Gates are generated by the generator. That's been a really fun way to work all through this video, so I stuck with it. Why not? And that's this patch. A short and simple one with 3 individual pitches out of generator into my Eurorack patch for some poly or paraphonic Eurorack modular. So in this patch we're bringing together a lot of what we've already looked at. As I have the normal desktop unit and Eurorack generator module, figured why not clock them. So internal clock goes out to my modular system and also clocks the desktop top one, the generator as well. I'm using my kind of fake gate sequencer type patching that we've done earlier by turning up certain steps, patching up some drums and effects in the background. The green cables are modulating this complex synth voice, modulating both FM and wave folding. There's the rhythm and kind of messy noisy effects in the background. And I'm using the generator, the voltage generator section, to actually play a synth voice. I'm using the semitone quantized outputs, which are volt per octave semitones. It's the only thing that's quantized about the unit. And I'm using the CV out, which is the pressure. Let's get that bass sequence back in. The CV out here, the pressure, is opening up a filter. These knobs, through their quantized outputs, are going to pitch. Obviously tons of effects on that. So that's it for the generator video. It's been a really fun, playable, performable sequencer to play along with Eurorack and kind of anything else that you've got CV that you want to throw at it. Been playing around with a couple of semi-modular synths that's been good fun as well. Hit subscribe, hit the thumbs up button, support my work on patreon.com/DivKid if you like what I do. Leave some questions in the comments. Let's chat about generator. Cheers for watching. I'll see you next time.